welcome to this meeting of the Planning Applications Committee. I'm Councillor James Husband, Chairman of the committee. To my right are my fellow councillors, and it will be the five of us who will make the decisions on the cases that are in front of us this evening. To my left are officers who will be presenting the cases and giving us advice, and they are led this evening by Lisa Chung, the lady to my immediate left, who's the head of development management. So if we can begin, Mr. Ebenezer, with apologies. Gareth?
No apologies, sir.
No, I think we should just note that Councillor Ali has replaced Councillor Larry, who I think was on some of the earlier published agendas, but that's entirely in order with our rules. Are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Evans.
I will not sit for Stanhope Mews East because it's in my ward, and I have been at a presentation from developers without an officer present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Spalding.
Chairman, on the item 7 Filbeach Gardens in the South Pack, I live in Filbeach Gardens, about 10 or so houses away, and my residents' association is listed as an objector, and I'm the vice chairman of that residents' association, so I think it's only correct I stand off the committee for that item.
Good. Thank you both for that. So when we reach those items, Janet and Malcolm will just take a seat behind us, so they will take no part in the discussion and decision making. So if we move on to this evening's agenda, I think it might be helpful if I indicate the order in which we're going to consider everything. We will start in a moment or two by the applications in Brunswick Gardens, then Cadugan Gardens, Stanhope Mews East, Stanford Road. We will then move on to consider the application in Ormond Gate, Filbeach Gardens, and conclude with Leyton House. Very good. So in that case, I think we can probably move to the very first application, which is relating to 19 Brunswick Gardens, and I think Derek Taylor, you're going to present that, aren't you? Derek.
Yes, Chairman, I'll be presenting those two. But what I'll do is obviously that, as you'll have seen from the agenda, there are two applications. Both of the applications include a rear extension, and one of them includes a basement. So I'll start with the first application, which is 4711, relating to the rear extension. And then for the second application, when we get onto it, then I'll just give a shorter presentation focusing mainly on the basement. Oh, sorry, you did that. Okay. Right, so just for the first slide, I'm obviously showing the Ordnance Survey extract, which you will see repeated in the committee pack. It's just to make sure that everyone's got the correct orientation in their minds, with number 19 Brunswick Gardens there outlined in red, and numbers 6 and 7 Berkeley Gardens immediately to their north, to its north, identified at the top part of the plan. I've got further slides to zoom in on the gardens. That's an aerial shot with the application property sort of starred there in red. When you look at that photograph, obviously the whole rear elevation effectively is the subject of the first application, but most of the discussion will focus on the sort of bottom left corner of the property. So you can see there at the moment there's a rear extension to the property that's sort of roughly central to the rear elevation. And then immediately to the left of that, to the north of that, there's a slightly more shaded area, and that's where the proposed extension is going to be. There is an extension proposed on the other side, but with a bit less focus on it. In the photograph, you can see that there's a shaded area immediately to the left or to the north of the flank wall to number 19. And that's actually the rear garden to, in fact, both 6 and 7 Berkeley Gardens. That's the existing rear elevation to the property. So you'll see it's got a single-storey extension at its, in the image at its bottom left corner, which is the northern side. And then there's also a smaller extension as well on the right-hand side of it. And then that's the proposed rear elevation. And there's now an extension proposed each side of the central element, which would be rebuilt in the proposal. And that's the existing side elevation. So there, if you focus on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see at the moment that there's a recess, which is the recess you saw in the photograph, with this sort of centralised extension immediately behind it. And then that's the recess infilled with the proposed extension. So that's the existing and that's the proposed. So you can see there the central part of the extension is squared off. As it stands at the moment, it's got a sloping roof, and that becomes a flat roof with the parapet around it. And then you'll see 2 blind windows. I mean, they're not windows, but it's an architectural device just to sort of articulate the elevation. And you'll see those on the flank of the extension. And I think that's a useful shot just to show the relationship of the proposed extension to number 6 and 7 Berkeley Gardens. So you can see there clearly where there's a recess at the moment, and you can see the relationship with that and the number 6 and 7 and the courtyard garden that separates the two. Now, you'll have seen a lot of correspondence and also discussion in the reports in relation to sunlight and daylight. That there are a lot of images in a number of reports that all relate to that. So I've just chosen a few here just to illustrate, I think, some of the key points. And the first image that I'm showing there shows in the left-hand image, identified in yellow, that's the amount of the rear garden that would, on a non-cloudy day, have sunshine at 2 p.m. on the 21st of March. And then the right-hand image shows the proposed extension identified in red, and then you can see in yellow that there's a slightly reduced area in yellow, which shows the amount of the garden that would be receiving sunshine at 2 p.m. on the 21st of March, after the extension that was built. And that slide is, I think you'll all have seen in the papers that have been distributed that there are a number of documents, but amongst those there was a transient shadow study. And I think out of all of the various images that you'll have seen, I think these ones do illustrate sort of quite graphically and sort of in an easy to interpret way the position with regard to sunlight and the gardens. So the first slide that I'm showing there is a 9 a.m. image, and you can see the proposed extension identified in red, and then the grey area immediately to the above that, to the north of that, is the garden. And what you can actually see there is that there's no sunshine on the garden at 9 a.m. on the 21st of March. You can see that the white areas just above the sort of grey, that shows that sunlight, or some sunlight at least, is reaching the rear elevation of the property, the building, at 9 a.m. But on the 21st of March, the sun's still too low for any sunshine to get down into the courtyard area at 9 a.m. At 1 p.m, the situation is quite different. At 1 p.m, even on the 21st of March, the sun is high enough to throw some sunshine into direct sunlight into the garden. You'll see the sunlit area of the garden there identified in the white colour. The grey colour that runs around the edge of the garden shows the area that at that time, even at 1 p.m, is still in shadow. And I think this image is very useful to show the shadow of the building itself and then the shadow of the proposed extension. So the extension as proposed is there in red. If you look at that, what's basically the roof of the extension, you can see it's almost divided into two by a diagonal line. And there's a lighter colour of red to the left-hand side of that line. There's a darker colour at the right. The darker colour at the right shows where the shadow of the existing rear extension to the property would fall. And then if you trace that across the courtyard garden to the top of the image, you can see that the existing building creates, identified in blue, or sort of, it is, yeah, basically blue. You'll see there the shadow of the flank wall of the existing building. To the left of that, identified in lilac, is probably the nearest. If you look at the lilac colour, that's the amount of the garden that would be that would have sunlight removed from it by the proposed extension at 1 p.m. Earlier than 1 p.m, that amount is less. Later than 1 p.m, that amount progressively lessens as well. So, you know, at 9 a.m. or 3 p.m, the garden is in shade at that time of the year. But I think the 1 p.m. slide shows it sort of most effectively. So that's basically the worst case scenario, at which point 43% of the area that currently receives sun would now be in shade, along with the rest of the garden to its right-hand side. So I think that's the same image, but I just zoomed in a little bit, just in case it wasn't clear enough on the screens in here. So that's the whole image, and then that's the zoomed-in image. So again, the lilac colour shows the area that's currently sunlit at 1 p.m. on the 21st, and would not be sunlit at 1 p.m. on the 21st with the extension. And that's the proposed roof plan, so you can see there the extensions to either side of the central extension, which projects a little bit further. And then that's the existing front elevation, not much changing there, only at the lower ground floor level. And that's the proposed the front elevation. And that now is a photograph where you can see the magnolia tree that you'll have seen discussed in the reports and other documents, clearly there to the left-hand side of the photograph. And then you can see the existing rear extension with its sloping roof towards the centre right of the photograph. And you can see a little piece of trellis, and that's basically the position in the photograph where the proposed extension would be built. And that's looking now across the garden. So you can see there the magnolia tree, again, very central to the image. And then to its left and above it is the flank wall to number 19. And that's the picture just simply showing the trunk to the magnolia tree and its proximity to the flank wall of number 19. And that's the last slide, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we've got a couple of people registered to speak about these applications. Excuse me. First of all, I'm going to ask Mr. Gray-Muir, and I think you, sir, are an objector, and you're representing Roger Henderson, who lives in Berkeley Gardens. Is that right, sir? Yeah? So I'm going to ask you to speak first. So you've got up to 3 minutes to speak. You will be able to speak again, if you wish, when we come to consider the second application. But whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Clearly? Good.
Yes, I can. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. You will have seen from my original representations that for the first 11 months of this 13-month process, the applicant repeatedly misrepresented the basic facts about how much sunlight my father-in-law's flattened garden gets. You'll also note from my second representation that when the applicant finally corrected this error, they fell back on an argument that only considered the impact of the development on 1% of the garden, that part which received 2 hours of sunlight on the 21st of March, wholly ignoring the impact on the remaining 99% of the garden, which didn't get 2 hours of sunlight at that point. Neither BRE guidance nor RBKC policy permit such an approach. From my most recent representations, you will know that the report which the Council seeks you to make a judgment on makes factual and mathematical errors, misstates and misapplies the BRE guidance, and as a result, presents a seriously misleading picture of the impact of the proposed development, though I have to say Mr. Taylor's presentation has gone a long way to correcting that. But these errors are summed up in one key assertion in the report, that there would be a 1 to 4% loss of sunlight to the garden on the 21st of March. In truth, during the hours when direct sunlight reaches the garden, between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the 21st of March, there would be a loss of between 22% and 45% of the sunlight currently available to the garden. And in fact, if you look strictly at the 2-hour sun contour referred to by the applicant and in the report, the reduction is 100%. The impact of the extension has a more widespread effect than the simple percentage loss of sunlight. In the opinion of the chief arboriculturist of Kew Gardens, the extension would put the large magnolia tree into decline and, I quote, would place a considerable amount of stress on this tree, weakening it severely and putting it in decline. That is the tree which currently screens the 6-metre wide by 12-metre tall brick wall, which already dominates the garden. Without that tree, and with the near 50% increase in the wall as a result of the extension, it's hard to see how a sense of enclosure referred to in CL5 could not be materially worsened by the proposed extension. Conservation area policy precludes causing damage to trees. You will also have seen the serious errors in the manner in which the impact on daylighting to the flat has been measured. Windows have been missed, rooms misdescribed, and windows conflated so that by averaging they pass the test, which if BRE guidance is heeded, they would fail. It is not acceptable that this part of the applicant's case still relies on the report, which was proved to be so embarrassingly wrong in relation to sunlighting and is known to contain very material surveying errors. In summary, your officers have been misled, and I ask that, applying your good sense to the science and to the probabilities, you refuse permission.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, we're also joined by Chris Jones and Stuart Cobbold, and I think you are representing the applicant, is that correct? So in similar fashion, when you're ready, please go ahead, and I don't know how you want to split up the time, but that's absolutely fine. Of course, yeah, thank you.
My name is Chris Jones of First Plan. We're the planning consultants working on the project. The application before you is the culmination of around 20 months of engagement between the applicant and the planning department. At each turn, the applicants have responded positively to any requests for amendments to the scheme, further clarifications and further reporting made in good faith at all occasions. The result is a sensitive and well-considered extension to this family home and a very robust and comprehensive householder planning application. The application is supported by all regards by the planning team. Whilst it is appreciated there may be a difference in professional opinion in regards to daylight and sunlight, the only independent objective assessment before the committee is that the planning department has made, which supports the conclusions of the applicant that there is no material worsening in accordance with policy CL5. We therefore request that the recommendation for approval is followed by officers. I'll now pass over to Stuart.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Stuart Cobbold, the applicant's daylight and sunlight consultant. A bit about me. I have a master's degree in surveying. I'm a chartered surveyor and a director of Schofield Surveyors Limited. I've undertaken daylight and sunlight analysis for this application and authored responses to objections received to the application. In particular, these objections relate to 7A Berkeley Gardens. I've been in consultancy providing daylight and sunlight advice for 16 years and have worked for specialist London-based practices including Delver Patman Redler and, as I say, Schofield Surveyors, but also at multinational property consultancy Jones Lang LaSalle. I've advised and reported on numerous development schemes across London and beyond. Following responses to the applicant's initial daylight and sunlight report, I was instructed to provide a fresh analysis, which has been undertaken using more robust survey data. Although the applicant's first report can be said to have been undertaken using a common and accepted approach, my subsequent analysis has employed more accurate measurement techniques. Both the first report and my subsequent analysis have been scrutinised by the council officers, who agree with the findings and that there would be no material worsening to the daylight and sunlight of surrounding properties. With regard to 7A Berkeley Gardens, we've shown that there's a 1.2% of the courtyard that received 2 hours of sunlight on March the 21st. This is the date recommended in the BRE guidance. And the proposal would reduce that area of 1.2 square metres. When measured on the 21st of June, 80% of the courtyard receives at least 2 hours of sunlight, with only a fractional reduction resulting from the proposal. The report submitted by the applicant has shown that reductions of daylight to the windows surrounding the properties are within acceptable parameters as described in the appropriate BRE guidance, and no impacts to the light to neighbouring windows should be considered material. The officers are satisfied the reduction shown by the analysis presented shows non-material impacts to neighbouring amenity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So colleagues, our opportunity to ask questions of any of the parties. Who'd like to go first? Janet.
I'd like to know how much consulting has been done with Mr. Henderson, please.
We don't, as a rule, we haven't, I should just answer the question plainly, we haven't consulted Mr. Henderson directly, other than to receive a drawing showing the layout of his property. That's normal practice in daylight sunlight assessment. We rarely, if ever, consult or need to consult with neighbouring owners.
Did you want to answer that as well?
Could I speak on that? The problem here is that the deficiencies in the original report were pointed out to the applicant many months ago, long before this recent change of the final report that's been put in so recently. And the problem in terms of the daylighting is that there has been no on-site survey which informs the daylighting assessment. There has been an update to the sunlighting assessment, not to the daylighting assessment, and that daylighting assessment relies on a survey which is known to be flawed. Mr. Henderson has asked repeatedly for the applicant to visit the site and look at his building so he can understand what the use of the rooms is and what the size of the rooms is, and that has been refused.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kasim and then Malcolm.
Thank you. This follows with daylight. Again, the report says here 1 to 4%, and what you've told us here is 23 to 45%. That's a big gap. So how do you come to the conclusion of 23 to 45% of loss of daylight?
The reason for the difference is the 1 to 4% figure. I'm sorry, I sent you all a very, very complicated analysis of why it was wrong. The 1% figure comes from the reduction in the 2-hour sun contour on the 21st of June. Now that's a completely meaningless concept in terms of BRE guidance, and I sent you an analogy about that recently. I don't know if you had the chance to see that, but it is not something that's considered. It's like trying to measure a marathon, a 100-meter sprint with sorry, this is rather difficult. It's like trying to measure a 100-meter sprint with a hourglass. It's just the wrong measure to use at that time of year. If you were going to look at the 21st of June, you might use a 6-hour sun contour, because if 50% of your garden was within a 6-hour sun contour on the 21st of June, that might be, say, an averagely lit garden. So the 1% is completely meaningless, which is what Mr. Cobbold has just referred to. The 4% came from an erroneous calculation where the officer writing the report found that the reduction at 1 p.m. in sunlighting to the garden was 5.44 square meters. And instead of that, applying that to the 12 square meters that there were before, which is an 8% reduction, for some reason they applied it to, is a 43% reduction. For some reason they applied it to the size of the whole garden. And in fact they got that wrong, because it should have been an 8%. 5.44 is 8% of 68, whereas they've come up with 4% for some reason. So so both of those numbers, 1 and 4%, are completely meaningless. And I'm sorry, they're just erroneous.
Kasim, I think it might be appropriate if we ask the applicant's agents to respond to the same question. I think that might be helpful. Do you have any comment to make about that?
Yeah, thank you. I would disagree that the use, or the 1% or 1.2% 2-hour sun contour figure is erroneous. It is the measure recommended by the BRE guidance. That guidance only provides one method to, one method that has a threshold, a pass threshold applied to it, and that is the 2-hour sun contour, which derives the 1.2% of the existing, of the courtyard. So that is why it's been used. It's in line with recommendations. The 43% figure applies to a particular moment during the day, where the sun is reduced by that figure. The BRE provides no, as I say, no numerical benchmark to assess transient shadowing, which is where that 43% comes from. It says that it may be useful in certain contexts, particularly where large development's concerned and a number of gardens are to be affected. But the only numerical benchmark is relating to the 2-hour sun contour, and that's why it's been provided. It does go on to say, the BRE does go on to talk about additional forms of analysis, and an analysis that can be undertaken at different times of the year, such as in June, and we've provided that for additional context, as we have with the sun path drawing or sun path diagram that's included in the application.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chairman. Just can I establish for the record, Mr. Graham, you're authorised to speak for Mr. Henderson. And Mr. Henderson lives at 6A and 7A.
Yes, his garden level flat covers the 2 houses, 6 and 7 Berkeley Gardens, so it covers 2 of the spaces marked in the plan.
And the garden, in your transient analysis that you supplied,
yes,
the garden we're talking about is the area you've marked with a green perimeter.
It's outlined in the light green.
And what area is that garden?
It's 68 square metres.
68 square metres.
And that compares to an average across London of 145 square metres.
And so that space between 7A and 19,
yes,
which seems to be mostly hard landscaped,
yes,
although it's got a magnolia tree that you referred to, that's 68 square metres. So it's about 5 or 6 metres by 12 metres.
It's approximately, the length of the wall is is 9 metres, so it must be about, 9 metres by 7 metres, something like that.
Okay. And I think in your analysis, with this sort of swept path analysis or transient shadow study, you're saying up to 12 square metres would be cast into extra shadow at 1 p.m. on the 21st of March.
There is an extra, yes. The highest level of extra shadowing is actually at 2 o'clock, but percentage-wise the reduction is smaller. So at 2 o'clock, I forget the exact numbers, but you should have them. I could dig them out if you need them.
Why I'm labouring this is because that seems to quantify the amount of harm which you're saying this development would do to Mr. Henderson's property.
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make, because what Mr. Cobbold has said ignores the fact that the BRE is very specific in stating that analyses should be done on the 21st of March because it represents the average condition during the year. And that's why we always use that. That's why June is not irrelevant, 21st of June is not relevant. It's very easy for a garden to pass the 2-hour sun contour test on the 21st of June, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, and then 2 other quick questions, and then I'll go to the applicants. The analysis of loss of light to windows and so on, is Mr. Henderson worried about that?
Yes, he is, but it's the problem we have on that one is that the survey data that was provided by T16, who are acting for the applicant, is wholly inadequate. The original report, there's been a series of something like 4 reports they produced. The first one completely missed every single window in Mr. Henderson's flat. The second report, I think it conflated windows and it still missed windows. The current report still misses windows and ignores the impact of an overhang and joins 2 windows together, which means that you get an erroneous result in terms of the reduction of the vertical sky component calculation. So my point is, it is a very, very poor report. That's been accepted in relation to sunlighting, but it's still being relied on in relation to daylighting. So in truth, we just don't know. The information just isn't good enough.
So there is loss of vertical sky element and general light, but you can't put a figure on it.
Well, the applicant hasn't tried to put a figure on it, and it's not, they've just ignored it. They've just produced, just as they originally produced, an entirely bogus sunlighting analysis. They're producing a deeply deficient daylighting analysis on the building. They just surveyed the wrong thing.
Okay, last question for you, and that is, I like your analogies of loss of pizza and the last brick in the prisoner's window. This garden, as it's described, do you think it's fair to describe it as a lighting well? I mean, it's been put there by whoever built these houses as a means of giving light to the rear windows of 7A.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And you look at the pattern of development around that area and the grain of the development, and there is always this gap between the main terraces and the side terraces, effectively. And because of the north-south orientation of Berkeley Gardens, you're always going to have a large gable impacting on the garden at that east side of a square of development, and it's also the fact that the central closet wings, which are the sort of mid extensions on all of the houses, on the odd numbers on Brunswick Gardens, I don't think there's any other case where there's an extension on this scale on both sides of it, and it just happens that this is the point at which it is most harmful.
Okay, thank you. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions, anybody? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed. So, Colleagues, we now have the opportunity to ask officers questions. Who would like to go first? Actually, I might start. Mr. Taylor, in the report, it's paragraph 1.2. We've got this 1 to 4% figure, which it's been challenged, saying this is not actually a true reflection of really what the situation is. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, Chairman, I haven't sort of attempted to do the measurement myself, but I mean, I think that the case officer was just trying to illustrate that the amount of the total courtyard or the total garden, because that was presented obviously in the submitted documents. I mean, 3.7% is the figure that's given in the report. To be honest, I mean, I've got no grounds to sort of challenge the information that we hear, that actually it's probably 8% rather than 4%. I'd be quite happy to take the 8%. I mean, I think in terms of a measure, I don't think the decision really should rely or turn too tightly on the difference between 4% and 8%. The important thing is to understand the relationship between the buildings and the impact on the garden, the usability and enjoyment of the garden. A small difference in a percentage is just one ingredient in that. I mean, the figure of 5.44 square metres losing sunlight, I mean, I think that may well be 8% of the garden, so I'm willing to take that figure. But I don't think that figure in itself really gets us that far. It's the bigger picture that's important to understand.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Kasim.
Thank you, Chair. My point is going back to the figures again, what we have here, 1 to 4% of sunlight loss, as well as what the objector just said, which is a 25 to 45%. So can you give us a bit of details about the method, 23 to 45%? Can you give us the method has been used and what time of the day has been used?
I think I'm probably the wrong person to talk about the method that was used in any of the studies. I mean, as we know, that there have been 4 studies carried out on behalf of the applicants, plus the neighbours have carried out their own evaluation of it. So methodology is not really something I could comment on. I can help you interpret the figures though, and the figure of, in the report, 3.7%, or in fact it's probably 8%. I mean, that's actually a figure measured on the whole garden. So that's one figure, one piece of information. Another very useful piece of information relates to the spring equinox on the 21st of March. The same would be true pretty much on the 21st of September, which would be on that day, at 1 p.m, we're looking at a reduction of 43% of the existing sunlit area. So the 3.7% in the report, or 8% as it might well be, is focusing on the whole garden, whereas the 43%, that's not focusing on the whole garden, that's focusing on the area that would get sun on a sunny day at the moment, that wouldn't get sun after the extension was built. So 43% is a measure within the existing sunlit area.
Malcolm.
Just to pursue that theme a little, we're very often told in terms of loss of light that the BRE standards give amounts of light that new developments would be expected to provide. That's sort of bottom up. But we've got a situation, and I think it's often top down. We've got an existing situation with an amount of light that's being reduced. And it might well be still above the BRE standard, but that doesn't mean to say that the existing amount of light has been reduced and that the existing amenity has been harmed. It's okay, the harm has happened, it's still above the minimum standard from the BRE, but it's top down, it's been harmed. And I think that's happened here, that there will be loss of light to windows, although that hasn't been quantified very well. I'm not sure whether you think that's material. Do we just have to stick with the BRE minimum standard, or can we accept there has been harm in terms of sunlight and in terms of loss of light?
Yes, I mean, there are obviously a number of elements within your question there. I mean, the BRE guidelines, I think that the first thing I'd say is the name of the guidelines says it itself. They are guidelines. They're not a hard and fast rule. The BRE guidelines are a tool, and they're a very useful tool. They don't sort of seek to dictate, or they couldn't prescribe a point at which planning permission should be refused. All they're trying to do is illustrate a point at which an impact on daylight or sunlight would become material. And the best word to substitute for material would be noticeable. So the BRE guidelines use 20% as a yardstick. And what they're really saying is a loss of daylight, or in a different calculation, sunlight, in excess of 20% would be likely to be noticeable. There's nothing in the guidelines to suggest that as soon as a loss of either vertical sky component or sunlight, as soon as it becomes noticeable, then planning permission should automatically be refused. I mean, that's for the decision maker. That's for yourselves this evening, rather than for the author of the guidelines. In terms of the percentage, I mean, I can't go into the methodology in the study, but I mean, vertical sky components is the first thing I think that one would look for in a daylight study, and it does. The studies do set out the vertical sky component impact on the various windows in the neighbouring building. The case officer has also visited the neighbouring building because, as we know, there was a study window that was missed out from the original study. So the case officer has actually been inside the flat to assess it from that perspective, which to some extent would at least make up for any inadequacies in the original study. I think what the studies show is that there wouldn't be a material impact upon the interior rooms and spaces of the building. What the study also shows is that, for example, at 1 p.m. on the 21st of March, that there would be a material impact on the garden at that time. I mean, losing 43% of the presently available sunshine. I mean, I would describe that as a material impact on that day. That's a different thing to judging whether there would be a material and then whether there would be a harmful impact looking at the year in the round. And to do that, you've got to put together the impact on the interior of the building and on the garden. And then you've got to sort of effectively add the impact in vertical sky component terms internally to the impact in sunlight terms externally. What we do know is that there would be a noticeable effect in the garden at some times of the year. I think what we also know is that internally the impact in each room would be less than 20%. So you do have to put the two together.
Any other questions? No. Okay, in that case, we need to reach a decision, I think. I think I would start by saying, to my mind, it's quite clear that the impact on the garden and the rooms here for neighbours, clearly it's unwelcome. And this is the difficult bit. We have to decide whether something that's unwelcome actually moves further to the point where it's actually unacceptable in planning terms. I think there are a couple of sides to this argument. I think it's important to accept that in an urban area like RBKC, there are many gardens and courtyards which are in shade most of the time. It's just the nature of a heavily built-up area. On the other hand, a reduction, as has been pointed out, a reduction in the amount of sunlight coming into a garden space, that is something that clearly does have an impact. So I'd really like to invite a few quick comments, and then I think I'll probably move to a vote on the recommendation, and we will go from there. Is there anyone who would like to make a quick comment now? Janet. Councillor Evans.
I have an issue with the discrepancy between the findings of the test. And I think that it's very difficult to grant permission when we don't really know exactly which tests prevail.
Okay. Anyone else care to mention? Well, I think probably what we should do to move forward is that I should put the recommendation to the vote. So the recommendation, now this is the first application in our pack, the 104711. So the recommendation is to grant, with obviously the conditions set out in the report. Can I see those in favour of the recommendation, please? Okay, I will. All right, those against? Okay, so that is 2 votes in favour of the recommendation, 3 against. So the recommendation is not adopted. On that basis, we need to consider what the resolution for refusal might be. I think having heard the discussion, and I'll bring in Mr. Taylor and maybe Ms. Chung as well. I think that probably reason for refusal is a loss of sunlight, and therefore enjoyment of the gardens of 7A and 6 and 7 Berkeley Gardens. I think also, and this obviously follows on, arguably a sense of enclosure to the garden as a result of that loss of light. Would that seem to you to be a reasonable basis of a resolution to refuse?
Well, I think, Chairman, it's important to focus on the relevant development plan policy, which would be policy CL5, which deals with living conditions or impact on living conditions. I mean, CL5 contains a number of criteria. I think the 2 that are particularly pertinent to the discussion and to the application would be CL5B, which relates to sunlight and daylight, so that they're together in one criteria. And then CL5D relates to sense of enclosure. So I think for your purposes, it would be better to consider each of those, CL5B and CL5D. You could find that the application would have an unacceptable impact in terms of both of them, and then both would be quoted in a reason for refusal. Or you could find that it was sun and daylight, but not sense of enclosure, in which case we just specify CL5B. So just to remind you again, B is sunlight and daylight impact, and D is sense of enclosure.
So colleagues, I'm particularly looking at those of you who were against the original recommendation. What do you feel about these reasons for refusal? Are you inclined to go along with both that Mr. Taylor has outlined, or how do you see it? Just briefly, Hamish.
after all, the proposal effectively, it seems to me, would be blocking out what's a light well. And I would go further and add that it's actually doing material harm to the conservation area as well, but I'm happy to focus on just the loss of light.
I do. Happy with that?
Sorry, yeah, I do agree with that. I think it's both, but most likely it's CL5B that is most strong one. That's
All right. Janet, you go along with that?
I am in agreement with that.
Okay. Well, in that case, I think formally we need to adopt a resolution. Councillor Adurian, would you like to propose that we refuse for the reasons that Mr. Taylor set out, focusing on CL5B, which is daylight sunlight, and who would like to? Councillor Ali seconds. Okay, so if that resolution, can I put that to the vote? Can I see those in favour of that resolution to refuse? Those against? Okay, so that is carried. Thank you.
Did you abstain?
I abstain, sorry, I beg pardon, yes. Okay, thank you. Mr. Taylor, can we now move on to the second application, which is the second one in our pack, and this is one 5276. Derek, do you want to introduce that?
Yes, Chairman. So I'll flick through the first few slides here because they're basically a repeat of the last application. This application contains a proposal for an extension which is identical to the one that you've just refused. So then it goes without saying that would apply, obviously, to this application. The difference between them is that this application contains a basement. And so that's the drawing I'm showing now is the existing section through the property. So you can see the front of the property there to the left and the garden at the rear to the right-hand side. And then that's the proposed section. So you can see there that there's a single-storey basement proposed to be excavated beneath the building. It's really largely beneath the property itself. You can see the rear garden at the right-hand side of the slide, and the basement does not extend onto the rear garden. It's virtually completely beneath the main building. And then that's the basement plan, and then the garden plan, or lower ground floor plan on the right-hand side. You can see there that there would be a roof light along the edge of the garden nearest to the house, but apart from that, the garden would not be affected. So that's the only additional part of the proposal. So just to recap, that this second application is the same in terms of the side extension or rear extension, but the basement is the additional part within it. I think it probably reflects, I dare say the applicants probably thought that the basement would be the more controversial part, hence they put that in one application. But it hasn't quite turned out like that.
Good, thank you. Now, Mr. Graymuir, if you wish to speak to the second application, you are very welcome to. Do you wish to add anything? That's helpful, thank you. Now, Mr. Jones and Mr. Cobbold, do you wish to say anything? Again, if you wish to, you've got up to 3 minutes.
There isn't a great deal more to say. I think we support the recommendation for approval. As with the previous application, there is nothing within this application that's before you that should warrant refusal on the grounds of the basement.
Okay, that's very kind. Thank you very much indeed. So colleagues, obviously given our previous determination, Mr. Taylor has explained the nature of this application. I think in the interest of consistency, are there any specific questions anyone has in relation to the basement that they'd like to ask anyone? No. I would just like to clarify, Mr. Taylor, that the basement proposed here appears to be entirely compliant with our policies. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Chairman. The basement complies with policy CL7.
Thank you. Well, in that case, colleagues, I think we can probably proceed to take a vote on the recommendation, bearing in mind what we've heard. So the recommendation is to grant permission with the conditions attached. Can I see those in favour of granting permission? Okay.
Chairman.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Lorna.
I think you've got to be careful here because it's exactly the same extension as the one you've just refused.
Yes.
The basement is an extra element. So
Yes.
you might find the basement is fine, but you are actually voting on the whole
Yes.
application, including the extension.
Yes, I think that's...
You have to be consistent.
Yes, I think that's actually, sorry, that's a very important point. Yes, yeah, no, yes, I think it's difficult when we have a whole series of applications, but yeah, so this is essentially, this is the same development as we had considered earlier, plus a basement. Now, we've heard from officers the basement element essentially is compliant with policy, but the extension element is exactly similar to what we considered earlier on. So the recommendation here is to grant. We have to obviously do this in a formal way. Recommendation is to grant with the conditions attached. Can I see those in favour of granting? There were 2 votes in favour and 3 against, okay? So the resolution, the recommendation is not approved. In terms of reason for refusal, I would suggest that we have exactly the same reason as previously, which is focusing on CL5B, which is daylight and sunlight. Can I ask Councillor Adurin, would you like to propose that as the recommendation for refusal for this application? Can I see a seconder for that? So Councillor Ali is going to second that. So can I see those in favour of the resolution that that is the reason for refusal? Okay, those against? I think Councillor Spalding abstained. So that reason for refusal, that resolution is carried. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Can we now move on to consider the application at 89 Cadugan Gardens? And I think Katie Harrell, Katie, you're going to introduce this, aren't you?
I am indeed. Thank you very much, Chairman. To start my presentation, I've included on the slide some aerial photographs of the site, as the recommendation in the report gives significant weight to the character and the context of the application site. So the property itself is marked there with the red bubble, and the application relates to the flat located at lower ground and ground floor level. So it's a 7-storey terrace property at number 89. You can see in the middle photograph, it's probably the easiest one to talk you through, the communal gardens. You'll also note that there is a large tree adjacent to the road, which you'll see mentioned in the report. This combined means that the views of the lower ground and ground floor of 89 are limited. So that slide hopefully just provided you with some helpful context for your assessment of the proposals. On to the application itself. So this slide shows you the existing rear elevation of the property. You'll note there is an existing small infill extension at lower ground floor. Under the proposals before you, an additional extension would be constructed at ground floor level above that infill extension, As you can see from the slide, the design of this is a fully glazed structure. Probably best understood in this sectional drawing, it shows, as I say, the glazed nature of the extension and its profile. So it incorporates a monopitch sloping roof, which slopes downwards from the rear elevation of the property. You'll also see it extends out but stops 1 metre before the rear wall of the closet wing. So it would be set back from the established rearmost building line. Again, the section from the other side showing you that setback. A couple of photographs to finish on. This photograph shows you the existing extension at lower ground floor, and then I've labelled there the window to flat 2, which is above the application site. And if you remember that drawing I showed you with the pitched roof, the glazed roof would start below that window and then slope away from it down towards the communal garden. This slide just shows you the view of the rear of the property from Cadugan Square. You probably can just about make out there is a dotted red line which shows you the location of the extension. I think this slide is helpful in illustrating how visible it would be in public views. And then the very last slide just shows you some closer images of the application site, demonstrating the visibility of it from the immediate boundary of the property. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I think Rebecca Zard, you have registered to speak, and I think you're the neighbour immediately above. Is that right? Yeah. So, please, when you're ready, you've got up to 3 minutes to speak, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, committee. I've taken the time to read the report, and while I understand the director's perspective, I think that inadequate consideration has been paid to the key issues the report proposes to address. It's also not clear to me why the report now recommends that the committee grant planning permission. There's been no significant change in circumstance between the original proposal that was subject to pre-application advice and the current proposal capable of warranting a different conclusion. I have 3 points I would like to highlight to the committee. The first point is to do with light disturbance. I disagree that the proposal would ensure a good standard of living conditions for other residential occupiers. I disagree that there is a chance that light displays will fall within an acceptable level. I only have 2 living spaces, my living room and bedroom. The infill will be directly beneath my bedroom windows, and I will have to accept some change in my living standards because I will have to suffer potentially additional light disturbance. I have nowhere to go to if the infill is used until the early hours of the morning for entertaining. You'll note the infill is right next to the dining room on the ground floor plans. Secondly, the effect of the infill on the local area and the building itself. The proposed infill is the only proposal of its type in the area, and yet the report recommends that the committee grant planning permission. Not only will the infill be out of character with the rear of the building, there are specific practical issues with the proposal. Generally, for the flats that look out onto the light well, 5 flats in total, all the pipework for their kitchens, including my kitchen, run up the side of the light well and directly above the infill. Clear access is needed whenever there's any piping issue, and building the infill will not only be more costly to put up scaffolding around the infill structure, but will also make it more difficult to do. Access to the rear part of the building will therefore be reduced, contrary to policy CL9I, which has not been dealt with in the report. The infill will also be visible from my kitchen window, and in the views of all the objectors will be detrimental to the rear of the building. As dirt and grime builds up on the pitched glazed roof, the infill will be even more unpleasant to look at from my kitchen window. It's not made clear in the report how the infill would be beneficial to the building or preserve its character or appearance. Finally, the proposal is unnecessary and places a disproportionate burden on other residents. If the proposal's justification is to gain additional living space, it's not clear how 7 meters squared gained overcomes the detrimental effect that the infill will have to the rear of the building, as well as its effect on my living conditions and the practical points I've raised. This is particularly so when you consider the space already available to the applicant, a 125 meter squared flat spread out over 2 floors, which already contains an office/guest bedroom. If additional living space is the real justification, the applicants could choose to enclose their lower ground terrace, which would have the twin benefits of 1, gaining the applicant an even greater amount of space than the current proposal for additional living space, and 2, doing away with all the objections I've raised before you today. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So, colleagues, any questions to Mr. Markham?
You mentioned the increase in space for this flat beneath you, and you also mentioned access for pipework. Now, are you aware that those really are not planning matters, that this space belongs to the freeholder of this block, and so flat 2 will have to purchase that space from the freehold owner of the block? And so I've just finished the question, then you can answer. And so, of course, it will add value and add space to that flat. Sorry, your flat is flat 2, yeah. And so this is flat 1. It will add value to that flat. Well, that's not a planning matter. We would only be concerned with how it looks and how it articulates and relates to the surroundings and so on. So even though it might be granted tonight, my first question is, are you aware it may never happen because that flat can't buy the space from the freeholder? I'm not sure what your relationship is to the freeholder. Secondly, if we granted permission, it may never happen because your freeholder would have to agree to give a license for alterations, and you may not be willing to do that if you have any control over the freehold. So we might say, in theory, yes, it's okay, it's possible. Are you aware it may never happen for those 2 reasons?
I don't know if that, sorry, thank you. So I am part of the freeholders of the building. I know that they would have to be required to apply for a license to alter, although I believe that legally speaking, the freeholder could only object, but could only object reasonably and with certain conditions. I think that's the legal position. The main points I just wanted to highlight was that beyond the question of access, which will be dealt with presumably with a license to alter, it's mostly how the infill looks at the rear of the building, and I'm not convinced that it's really, not visible, because what those pictures don't show is that yes, there's a tree, and yes, there's a row of hedges, but those rows of hedges, the garden configuration can easily change. It's not a thick hedge, you can still see things. And I will also have to look out onto it from my kitchen window, and given it's glazed, dirt will obviously build up. I don't think it's necessary, especially if it is going to disrupt the sort of symmetry of the back of the building in such a beautiful area of London, really.
Kazim.
Thank you, Rebecca, for coming this evening. Apart from that's unpleasant to look at it from your kitchen window, is there any other effects it has this development caused you, for example, lighting issue or light pollution, for that matter?
So that was one of the first points that I raised. So I have 2 windows that overlook it. I've got a big kitchen window, and then to the side in the light well, my bedroom windows overlook the infill. So I am quite concerned, given the way light reflects through the light well, and given the glazed structure, that if lights are turned on in that room until the late hours of the evening, that will be directly underneath my bedroom window. And I obviously haven't had an expert report to quantify the light disturbance, but I believe that it could be significant, which is why I filed the objection, is why I've appeared before you today.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, Janet, last question, just quickly.
Have you discussed the alternative proposal that you have with your neighbor?
I haven't, but that's partly due to the fact that the original proposal wasn't discussed with me at all. And so I feel it would be out of place to raise that with them after they've already submitted an application.
Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed. So, colleagues, we now have an opportunity to ask officers about this. I'd like to start. I mean, light pollution is something that's often raised, and lots of people don't like, in effect, glass box extensions. We're familiar with that. I'm just wondering, in this case, the glazed roof of the proposal, might there be some kind of condition that we could attach to the permission, which might help mitigate this? What are your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. That would be an option open to members if they felt that might overcome the concern about light spillage. There's various ways that an opaque frosting or barrier can be applied to the glass, which would reduce light spillage as well as help with any privacy concerns that you may also have. And I think it would be entirely reasonable to apply such a condition. And just a note on light spillage, it is recognised that there would be some from the extension. However, it is already a built-up environment. There are already 3 windows in this location, and so officers are of the view that it's largely comparable with what is there. But obviously, as we've just discussed, that condition might give you some more comfort on that.
I mean, I think, thank you. Colleagues, I mean, I think this may well be a sensible way forward. Obviously, there are tests for conditions that have to be met, but I think if officers are saying that that's something that's acceptable, that we can do that, then I would be very much inclined to do that by way of mitigation to the points that are made. I think some of the other points raised, I think as Councillor Spalding has said, they're really slightly separate matters from the planning system. Not saying they're not important, but they're not our business. So perhaps we can make a... Malcolm, yeah.
The architects have produced some plans, Granite are the architects, but what I find slightly deficient, there are lots of elevations, cross-sections, but only 2 plan views are given. The very first one in the pack is the proposed ground floor plan, and then it's the penultimate one is the proposed works in the lower ground floor. The lower ground floor, I don't think we're actually considering. We're looking at the ground floor. Well, the plan there, the first one we've got, I mean, it just shows a dotted line, and it says, written sideways, rear extension. I mean, that's the building line coming out. But it's very deficient in detail. It doesn't show, thickness of walls or materials. And I'm not sure we've got anything we can actually... I mean, is that enough for us to make a decision? It's very deficient on materials, as you pointed out, Chairman, because it says on the cross-sections, it refers to aluminium gutters, and it refers to proposed structural glazing. So I'm not sure whether this is a substantial building or whether it's just all glass. It's not clear to me from these plans at all, and what we're actually approving. There are no materials for the structure of this thing. It just says proposed structural glazing. It doesn't talk about any other material at all.
Let's ask Katie Harrell. Have you any comments about this?
Only that Councillor Spalding's quite right that the drawings are minimal, but that is as a result of the design. It is supposed to be a largely frameless glass box, with very minimal materials other than the structural glazing, and then that aluminium gutter that's seen on both the elevation and on the sectional drawings. But yes, there is limited information, but that's as a result of a very simplistic design, I think, rather than that there's necessarily more to it than we've been provided.
Well then, thank you, Chairman. I think your line that we've got to specify some conditions about materials, I think that's where we're going, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, thank you. So what I would suggest is that we take a vote on the recommendation, but I think before we do, I think we need to say that there needs to be a third condition added that says that the materials need to be checked beforehand, and also I think the glazed roof has to be something that is to some extent opaque or does something to prevent upward light spillage. Is that something that is that enough to give you and your colleagues sufficient to be able to frame a condition in due course were we minded to grant this?
I think so, thank you, Chairman. I'd suggest, rather than just conditioning that the roof should be opaque, that we actually ask for the details, and that way we can capture, hopefully, Councillor Spalding's concern as well, and ask for full details of all materials, and specify within that condition that the roof should deal with the light spillage issue.
Okay, no, thank you. I think that's exactly the right way to deal with this. So with that condition added, the recommendation is to grant permission. Can I see those in favour of that recommendation on that basis, please? Those against? Okay, so that's granted by 4 votes to 1. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Move on to consider the application at Stanhope Mews East. And I think Councillor Evans is just going to step aside just for this application. Katie, you're going to introduce this, yeah.
Thank you very much. The application site is a 2-storey mews property at the end of the terrace on Stanhope Mews East, outlined there by the red line on the aerial image on the screen. The green line outlines the Glendower Preparatory School, which is located at numbers 86 and 87 Queen's Gate. I'm just going to start by showing you a few photos. I'm sure you're all familiar with the school, but just to remind you, here's the school, the frontage on Queen's Gate, and then the school from Stanhope Gardens. And you can see through the gate there's an external area which is in use as the playground area with the school. And then this is the Mews property itself, to which the application relates. So this is looking onto the front of the building. So planning permission is sought for a mansard roof extension to the Mews property. The drawings are included in your pack, but I've included this little sketch as I think it's the easiest way to illustrate the proposed development. You'll also have seen from the report that planning permission was granted for a comparable mansard extension. It's almost identical. There were some differences in the location of the dormer windows, but largely the development was the same. That was granted in November 2019, and so remains extant. Just included this slide just to show you the length of the Mews, so you can see that mansard roof extensions very much are now part of the character of the Mews. The other part of the proposals is for the change of the use of the Mews property. It's currently in use as a residential home. Under the proposals, the ground floor level would be used by the Glendower School. And then the first and the new second floor created through the mansard extension would be used as a new nursery associated with that school. In terms of access to the new nursery, this would not be via the Mews, it would all be through a new door created on the Stanhope Mews elevation. You can see where the red circle is there. There's an existing double window that would be dropped to create a new access for the nursery. And then the playground area would also be used by the nursery children with staggered times with the school. We have had sight of a travel plan and information about the expected trip generation associated with the new nursery. It's located on the Mews property, adjacent to the residential properties, to be fixed shut. And I mention this as the agent has confirmed that the applicant would be happy to have those windows fixed shut should members' discussion lead that way this evening. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Well, there are no speakers for this case, so we move straight to questions to officers. Any questions? I've just got a couple of quick ones. First of all, my understanding of this is that essentially changing residential use to a school which is classed as social and community use, that is something which is supported by policy. Is that's correct? I've understood that correctly, yes?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Obviously, we're aware of the need for housing in the borough and the degree of protection that we give residential use. But social and community use is one of the recognised allowed changes in recognition of the contribution to the borough that those sort of uses do bring.
Thank you. Malcolm.
The residents are worried about additional traffic, and schools, of course, drop off and pick up, and it all happens at one time, and it does cause traffic problems. So, condition 13 talks about a travel plan. 3 quick questions, Rita. Is that a travel plan just for staff, or does it relate to parents dropping off and picking up? If it does relate to parents, could it be made more explicit that it should be staggered and that the nursery school times must be offset from the main infants, preparatory, junior school times, i.e. they mustn't all come at the same time. So the new journeys generated by the nursery must be offset from the current journeys. And then finally, that the Mews shouldn't be used at all for drop-off or pick-up or any traffic at all. The school should ensure that that's all done from the main Stanhope, the main street, not the Mews.
Yep, so hopefully I can answer those 3. So the travel plan, we have had a draft one submitted with the application, but we have secured one by condition as well, just to give us that additional security over it. But it does cover both staff and parents, so drop off and pick up. It is proposed to stagger the nursery drop off to be at least 15 minutes different to the school drop off and pick up. And it does specify that the Mews won't be used, and there will be a school marshal preventing people from going down there. So that is within the draft that we've already seen. We could include an informative to clarify that we would expect to see that as part of the final travel plan secured by that condition, if that would give you some extra comfort on that regard.
I think that's helpful. Can we just go back to, you said that the applicant's agent had agreed that some windows would be agreed that they'd be fixed shut. Can we just identify exactly where those are? Can you go to
Yeah, so if I use this illustration to show you, so here's the Mews property, hopefully you can see my cursor. Oh, sorry. I knew I was going to do that at some point. The illustration on the right-hand side, this is the proposed mansard, and then you can see the windows to the Muse property at the floors below. Then this property here at number 85, that is a residential home. So the agent has confirmed that they would be happy for the windows here, the two at first floor level, and the nearest dormer window to all be fixed shut to limit any noise transmission to the residential occupier next door.
Good, thank you. Well, I think that's useful too. So, colleagues, Kazim, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Chair. Residents have indicated that the proposal will not benefit a residential area. And also, if I just add another question to that, can you give bit details about that? And as we can see from here, there was a application or a decision has been made, has been granted in 27th of November 2019, and no implementation has taken place. Could you give us a bit of details about the history of that granted application and no implementation has happened since then?
So the permission was granted in November 2019 for a mansard roof extension, and it is yet to be implemented. Was that your question? Sorry. So they have up until next November to implement that in theory.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, still have a 3 week. I think it's about 3 years, isn't it?
That's right.
For that. Is it related to new application now? It's being asked for changing from residential to make it nursery.
So the proposal in 2019 didn't include the change of use to a nursery. This is a new element. And I'm sorry, I've already forgotten what you're about the school use in a residential area. Yes, obviously the rest of the Muse is residential use. However, there is an established school within the property immediately behind the Muse. The number of pupils attending the nursery is quite modest at 32, and so it's felt that a small nursery of that scale is unlikely to significantly impact the residents' living conditions, or given that there's very limited external changes, nothing really to suggest a nursery use in the Muse property, that in terms of character and appearance worries, that there would be no real impact from the change of use.
Okay, good. Well, in that case, I think we can probably make a decision. I think there's quite an interesting general point about whether our policies should allow the loss of residential to school use or other community use, but that's an argument for another day. The fact is these policies currently exist, and it's an important factor in determining this application. I would suggest that we accept the offer by the applicant's agent for the windows that Mrs. Hurrell outlined, that we accept the condition that they are fixed shut. I think we should add the informative, as indicated by Councillor Spalding, in relation to the travel plan, as that is firmed up. I think that's helpful. So with those two slight alterations, the recommendation is to grant, with obviously the other conditions as well. Can I see those in favour, please, of granting? Okay, so that's unanimous. So that's granted. Thank you very much indeed. Now I think we go back to the North Pack for 1 Stanford Road. So that's back to Derek Taylor. Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Okay. Right, this is an application to retain a bin store within the front gardens of the property. The first slide there just shows the property in relation to the street of Stanford Road, and you can see there St Albans Grove at the top part of the slide. And that shows the bin store. So in that image, you can see the garden gate to the left-hand side of the image, and then the entrance steps to the front door of the property with the up arrow, and then the bin store is in the bottom right of the photograph, or not photograph, the drawing. And that shows the bin store. So that image is obviously taken from within the front garden. You can see there it's a large bin store. That view obviously would not be seen by members of the public. That's purely a private view within the front garden. From outside the property, it would look like that. So essentially, the front boundary is such that the bin store is obscured behind it. You can see it, just a sort of glancing view through the front gate. You can see the bin store just coming into the photograph there, but behind the gate pillar. But ultimately, that's the last slide. It's recommended for approval simply because in officer opinion, there'd be no material impact on the character or appearance of the conservation area.
Good, thank you very much. Questions? Questions about this? Hamish.
The problem with hedges, obviously, is yes, they live or they deteriorate and sometimes die. If the planting was to fail, then clearly the bin store would become visible.
I'm just wondering if...
trying to think of how you could construct a condition that would be reasonable.
I'm just thinking, because I rather agree with the sentiment of Councillor Adurian's question there, and I'm thinking that we do sometimes place conditions requiring screening on, say, for example, the side of a roof terrace or something like that. And I agree these conditions sometimes they're pushing at the boundaries a bit of acceptability for conditions, but I think, I don't know, what do you think? I think it could be worth a try, because I think if that hedge was removed, then I think those bins would look quite conspicuous, frankly, and given the location that we're talking about. It would look sort of rather awkward having this great big structure sitting immediately behind railings. What do you think about that?
Well, it would be possible to have a condition to say that the planters, I mean, the hedge, all the hedging, as far as I can see, all the hedging is actually within the black planters that they've put along the front, so that the planting isn't in the ground. At the other side of the garden, the planting is in the ground. In other words, at the back of that photograph. But the planting along the pavement edge, it's all within planters. So a condition could certainly say that the planters along the front of the garden shall be maintained in that position. I'm not sure we could be too specific about what's in the planters, though. And that's the bit that's worrying me, because the planters themselves don't obscure much of the bin store. It's the plants within them.
The problem is the planters are not part of the application, are they?
They're within the red line of the application.
They're within the red line.
Yeah.
Could we use the planting condition in relation to, should it die within, is it 5 years, then it shall be replaced?
And
That's possible.
yes, we could do. I think the point about the application specifically is to retain the bin store. Yes. But I think because the planters are clearly related to the bin store and they're within the application red line, I think it would be reasonable to attach a condition relating to the planters.
And they are on the drawings. They're clearly shown on the drawings, aren't they? Yeah. So. No, I was just saying that they're shown on the drawings, the planning drawings that are before you, so they're included. It's not as if we're talking about something that's not shown.
Well, in that case, I think that was, sorry, I hope everyone heard that, but it was, Malcolm, do you want to make a quick one?
Well, another question. I mean, it is shown in the drawing. It's not labelled as a hedge, and the existing condition says that this shall only be done in exact compliance with the drawing, and the drawing shows something of a squiggly nature going round the perimeter, but it's not labelled what it is. So that's why it needs a condition beefing up to say it shall be some form of green wall that shields, as Councillor Dorian said, that these bins shall not become visible, because you've got to think ahead to enforcement. That if the hedge disappeared, how could it be enforced?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think actually, to be fair, that was the point that Lisa Chung was making, in fact, that probably on, it's on balance, we probably can have a condition exactly as you've both suggested. Lisa.
I mean, what I'd suggest is we have a standard planting condition, but that we add reference to the existing planting within the planters, should that die, so that it's very clear we're referring to that as opposed to anything else here.
Good. No, I think that's the right sort of approach. So, with a new condition added along those lines, the recommendation is that we grant permission. Can I see those in favour, please, of that? So that's agreed. Thank you. The recommendation's agreed. Thank you very much. Can we now move back to the South Pack, and this is Ormond Gate. Katie, back to you.
Thank you very much. I've started the presentation with some photographs of the existing water tank and the sloped glazed roof light you'll see referred to in the report. So it's proposed to remove both these elements. You can see, I've pointed it out in that yellow arrow, there's that water tank which is very visible on that roof. You can just about underneath that as well see, hopefully you can make it out, a window on the elevation there. So under the proposals, as well as removing that water tank, that window would be dropped. So there it is in existing and then proposed. So it would be dropped to create doorways and then a Juliet balcony. And then lastly, you can see on the roof where that large sloped roof light has been removed, a new flush flat roof light would be installed in its replacement. And those are the proposals.
Good, thank you very much. Colleagues, any questions on this application? I think one point that I noticed when I was looking at this, that a rather awkward and old water tank and also the roof light, which are both quite ugly, awkward structures, they're both being removed, aren't they? So both of those things are going as part of this.
That's right. I mean, the roof light, there's very limited views of, but I certainly think that removal of the water tank is to be welcomed, particularly, yes, as I say, when you look at this image, it is actually very visible even from lower levels in the streetscape. Yes, you can see that,
can't you?
Yeah.
Yes. No, that's right. That's right. Colleagues, any questions at all on this? No. Okay. Very good. Well, in that case, I think we can make a decision. So the recommendation is to grant with the conditions set out in the report. Can I see those in favour, please? So that's agreed. Thank you. Now, if we can now move on to Brunswick Gardens, and I think, Malcolm, you're going to step to one side for a moment.
So there's a few elements to this application. First of all, there is a proposal to amalgamate the existing second and third floor flats. So the plans on the screen before you at the moment show the current arrangement with two separate units, one on each floor. Under the proposals, there's the floor plan for you, just to show that this would now be reconfigured to create one home. The floor space would measure 141 square metres, which is below the threshold set out in our policy regarding amalgamations. Under the proposals, it's also suggested that a new roof terrace would be created on top of the existing extension at second floor level, that's shown in the bottom of the two images, and then a new access onto the main roof would be created. You can see that in the top of the two drawings. Regarding the principle of terraces, this slide just shows you photographs of the main roofs at the properties at number 5 and 8. You see it's well established that these roofs are used as amenity space and that railings feature at this level. Just briefly, there's the existing elevations and then the proposed on the screen, and I've highlighted in the blue circle there the proposed new railings at both levels. You'll also note there is a change to the doors at ground floor level. If I flick back, there was the existing, where there's sort of 3 individual double doors. These would be replaced with a larger opening. And then the last element is an extension at the existing lower ground floor level, rearwards, to create additional living space at that level. And those are the proposals before you.
Okay, thank you. So actually, quite a lot going on in terms of the application. A lot of sort of relatively modest elements. Any questions anyone has like to ask? I think just check. Sorry, I've got the orientation right. The terraces. These are looking out well over the Earl's Court site. Is that right? They're not looking across the road, if you like.
That's right. Sorry, I haven't included a site plan, but if you have a look at your pack, yes, they're at the rear of the property, and you can see the one to the main roof. If you have a look on the plan on the screen, you'll see it's set in from the edge of the roof on both the front and the back.
Yeah. No, that's. I just want to make certain I got that right. Any other questions, colleagues? No? Okay. In that case, thank you. In that case, the recommendation is to grant. Obviously, with it's necessary to have the legal agreement signed as well. So that's the recommendation. Can I see those in favour, please, of that? Those against? Councillor Adurian voted against, but that's carried by 3 votes to 1. Thank you. So finally, if we can return to the North Pack, and Derek Taylor, you're going to introduce Leyton House applications.
Yes, I am, Chairman. Basically, there are 2 applications, one for planning permission and one for list of building consent. They're brought before you this evening, not because there are objections, but simply because our delegated authority doesn't cover council's own developments under the normal powers. So there are lots of small-scale alterations to the building. You've got the full sort of set of drawings in the pack, so I'll just show you the small selection now, just to illustrate them. That's obviously Leyton House, a unique building and a very fine building. I thought I'd include one internal slide just to show how fantastic a building it really is. To try and sort of describe the alterations, this shows a section, obviously, through the building. You'll see there at the front and at the rear, through the section, there are a number of elements identified. Some of this is essentially redecoration that in itself wouldn't even require listed building consent. Other elements are small-scale alterations. That shows, again, that's the sort of rear elevation, the south elevation, and again, a number of alterations just taking place all the way through the buildings, really. That shows the front steps. You can see there a proposed grille to the left-hand side of the steps, and then to the right-hand side there's proposed to erect a trellis, which you can see there. In fact, in the left-hand photograph there, taken in 1906, you can just see a trellis to the right-hand side of the doorway. So it's proposed to reintroduce the trellis where it was in 1906. But that's just a snapshot of the alterations. So it's planning permission and listed building consent.
Thank you very much. Any questions at all about this? No. Very good. Well, in that case, we, as Mr. Taylor has said, we have two decisions in front of us. First of all, we have planning permission. Recommendation is to grant with the conditions attached. Can I see those in favour, please? So that is agreed. And finally, listed building consent. Recommendation is to grant listed building consent. Can I see those in favour of that, please? So that is agreed as well. Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, everyone. Thank you.